Behind their crystal champagne flutes, the Wellington Gala elite laughed and pitied Dominic, always echoing the exact same cruel question. How did a man like him end up with a whale like Victoria? They were blissfully unaware that she was already pulling the strings that would inevitably destroy every single one of them. Victoria Gallagher knew the exact dimensions of her invisibility. At 5'4" and pushing 250 pounds, she took up physical space, yet in the glittering, cutthroat world of Boston's high-stakes commercial real estate, she was a ghost. Or worse, a punchline. She stood near the sprawling ice sculpture at the annual Harrison and Cole Winter Charity Ball, wearing a custom navy blue gown that the tailor had politely called forgiving. Across the ballroom, her husband, Dominic, held court. Dominic was a masterclass in genetic lottery and tailored Armani. He had the kind of sharp, effortless charm that made venture capitalists open their checkbooks and made women forget their wedding vows. He was the golden boy of Sterling Real Estate Holdings, a rising titan who had seemingly built an empire out of thin air. "Victoria, darling, are you hovering near the hors d'oeuvres again?" The voice was like shattered glass. Victoria turned to see Serena Croft, the head of public relations for Dominic's firm. Serena was a stiletto of a woman, sharp, thin, and lethal, clad in backless emerald silk. Serena's eyes darted to the small crab cake on Victoria's napkin, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her predatory eyes. "Just admiring the catering, Serena," Victoria said, her voice mild, betraying nothing of the ice water in her veins. "Well, pace yourself," Serena laughed, a tinkling sound designed to carry to the nearby group of investors. "Dominic works so hard to keep the company lean. We wouldn't want his home life to reflect excess." A few of the junior partners standing nearby chuckled into their Scotch glasses. Victoria felt the familiar flush of humiliation burn the back of her neck, but she merely smiled, a placid, agreeable expression she had perfected over 7 years of marriage. She let them laugh, let them think she was just the complacent, overweight housewife who spent her days watching daytime television and eating bonbons while her handsome husband conquered the world. What Serena, the laughing partners, and even Dominic himself consistently failed to remember was the origin of that empire. Dominic hadn't built Sterling Real Estate Holdings from thin air. He had built it from Victoria's inheritance. Victoria was the sole heir to the Sterling Family Trust, a fortune quietly managed by the notoriously tight-lipped Berkshire Financial Group. When they married, Dominic had been a struggling broker with big dreams and empty pockets. Victoria, deeply in love and desperately wanting to be valued, had unlocked the capital he needed. She had stayed in the background, drafting the initial business models, doing the quiet, tedious risk assessments late at night, while Dominic played the charismatic frontman. Over time, as his success grew, so did his ego. And as Victoria's weight fluctuated due to a severe thyroid condition and the stress of a deteriorating marriage, Dominic's affection had curdled into barely concealed contempt. The true breaking point had arrived 3 weeks before the gala. Victoria had been in Dominic's home office looking for a misplaced tax document. Dominic was notoriously sloppy with his digital security, arrogant enough to believe his wife was too technologically illiterate or too lazy to snoop. He had left his iPad unlocked. An email notification had chimed. Serena Croft. Victoria hadn't meant to look, but the subject line caught her eye. The ball and chain. Her heart hammering against her ribs, she opened the thread. It wasn't just an affair she might have expected. This was a systematic, calculated dismantling of her life. Dominic. Just have to endure her at the Harrison and Cole event next month. After the Q3 earnings report, the restructuring will be complete. I've got the lawyers drafting the paperwork to dilute the primary shares. By December, she'll be bought out for pennies, and I'll file the papers. We'll be in St. Bart's for New Year's, babe. Serena. I can't wait. Honestly, Dom, I don't know how you look at her. It's physically revolting. Just make sure the trust loophole is secure. Victoria had sat in the leather chair for 2 hours, the iPad glowing in the dark room. She didn't cry. The deep well of sadness that had defined her marriage instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. They thought she was stupid because she was fat. They equated physical softness with mental weakness. It was the greatest miscalculation of Dominic Gallagher's life. Back at the gala, Dominic finally broke away from his circle of admirers and approached Victoria. He slid a perfectly manicured hand around her waist, squeezing the soft flesh just a little too hard. "Having fun, Bea?" he asked, his tone dripping with patronizing faux affection. "You look tired. Maybe we should get you home so you can rest." So you can meet Serena in the penthouse suite at the Four Seasons, Victoria thought. She had already tracked the reservation on his black Amex. "I am feeling a bit fatigued," Victoria said, her voice soft and compliant. "You stay, Dominic? Mingle? You know how important optics are for the firm." "You're a saint, Bea," he murmured, kissing her cheek. The smell of his expensive Tom Ford cologne made her want to gag. As she walked out of the ballroom, she caught Serena's eye. The other woman offered a triumphant, mocking little wave. Victoria nodded politely. Let them have the night, because tomorrow, the real work began. At 9 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday, while Dominic was at a breakfast meeting, GPS located him at Serena's upscale Beacon Hill townhouse. Victoria walked into the towering glass and steel offices of Sullivan and Cromwell on State Street. She didn't ask for the junior associates. She walked directly to the top floor and sat across from Jonathan Hayes, a senior partner known in legal circles as the executioner. Jonathan was a ruthless, 60-year-old shark who had been her late father's personal bulldog. He had been highly skeptical of Dominic from day one. "Victoria," Jonathan said, steepling his fingers. He looked at her over his reading glasses. "It's been a long time. You look... well. Don't lie, Jonathan. I look like a woman whose husband is feeding off her carcass," Victoria said flatly, dropping a thick leather binder onto his mahogany desk. "I want to initiate a corporate audit, followed by a total asset freeze." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. He opened the binder. Inside were printed copies of Dominic's emails, bank transfers, offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands, and a meticulous 50-page forensic accounting report that Victoria had compiled herself over the last 3 weeks. "He thinks he's diluting the Sterling Trust's shares in the company," Victoria explained, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. "He's been quietly transferring intellectual property and prime real estate deeds into a subsidiary company called Apex Ventures, a company co-directed by him and Serena Croft." Jonathan flipped through the pages, his eyes widening. "He's embezzling from his own wife, and he's doing it sloppily." He looked up at Victoria, a terrifying grin spreading across his face. "He thinks the original operating agreement allows for unilateral asset transfer." "Because that's what the copy in his safe says," Victoria replied. "But you and I know that the master document filed with the state in 2018 contains Clause 47B. Jonathan chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "The Arthur Sterling Clause. The one stating that any transfer of assets exceeding 10% of the company's valuation without the explicit, notarized signature of the primary trust beneficiary, you, constitutes corporate fraud and instantly forfeits the offending party's shares back to the trust." "Exactly," Victoria said. Dominic doesn't own Sterling Real Estate Holdings. He owns a mirage. I own the water. If we trigger this, Victoria, it won't just be a divorce. It will be a corporate massacre. The SEC will likely get involved. He could face prison time for wire fraud, given these Cayman transfers. Good, Victoria said. But not yet. I want him to climb higher. The firm's annual shareholder retreat is in exactly 45 days in Aspen. He plans to announce the company's IPO, finalize the restructuring, and, I suspect, publicly humiliate me by announcing our separation right after he secures his billions. And your counterplay? Jonathan asked, fully invested now. I want you to quietly buy up the debt of his 3 biggest individual investors, the ones who laughed at me at the gala, Harrison, Cole, and Miller. They're over-leveraged in commercial tech spaces right now. Buy their debt through blind trusts. I want to own their financial futures by the time we hit Aspen. Jonathan looked at the overweight, unassuming woman sitting across from him. The industry saw a punchline. Jonathan saw Arthur Sterling reborn. Consider it done, Victoria. Over the next month, the psychological warfare was agonizing. Dominic grew bolder. He began openly criticizing Victoria's appearance at the dinner table, making cruel jabs about her portions, suggesting she look into gastric bypass if she ever wanted him to look at her like a man looks at a woman. I'm focusing on my health, Dominic, she would reply mildly, pushing her plate away. In truth, she was focusing on her health. The stress was melting off her, but she hid it by wearing oversized, frumpy sweaters and baggy sweatpants. She spent her days entirely immersed in the financial matrix of Dominic's life. She discovered that Serena Croft had leveraged her own PR firm to take out a massive $4 million loan to buy into Dominic's fraudulent Apex ventures, using her Beacon Hill townhouse as collateral. Serena was all in on Dominic's lie. One afternoon, 2 weeks before Aspen, Victoria was at a high-end boutique on Newbury Street, ostensibly shopping for a coat for the trip. She was browsing the racks when she heard that familiar, tinkling laugh. Serena walked in, accompanied by Chloe Miller, the wife of one of the investors whose debt Victoria now secretly owned. "Oh, look," Serena whispered loudly to Chloe, pointing at Victoria's back. "The blimp is trying to find a tent for Aspen. I hear Dom is finally cutting the cord after the IPO. He told me he literally has to sleep in the guest room because her snoring rattles the windows." Chloe giggled cruelly. "I don't know how she dares show her face. If I looked like that, I'd hide in a cave." Victoria froze, her hand tightening on a cashmere scarf. The old Victoria would have run out of the store in tears. The new Victoria turned around slowly. She walked right up to Serena and Chloe. She didn't look angry. She looked profoundly calm. "Serena." "Chloe," Victoria said politely. "Victoria," Serena sneered, looking her up and down. "Shopping for the retreat? I'd stick to the men's section for outerwear. They have much broader shoulders." Victoria smiled. "Actually, Serena, I was just thinking about you. I drove past Beacon Hill today. Such a lovely townhouse you have. It would be an absolute tragedy if the bank foreclosed on it. The property taxes alone must be brutal." Serena's sneer faltered for a fraction of a second. "I have no idea what you're talking about. My finances are perfectly secure." "Of course they are," Victoria said smoothly. She turned her gaze to Chloe, whose husband's real estate debt was currently sitting in a file on Jonathan Hayes's desk. "And Chloe, tell Richard I hope that risky tech park investment in Silicon Valley pans out. Interest rates are so punishing these days. You never know when a bank might call in a loan." Both women stared at her, utterly bewildered. Victoria, the fat, stupid wife, wasn't supposed to know about commercial interest rates or private property deeds. "Enjoy the shopping, ladies," Victoria said, turning on her heel and walking out into the crisp Boston air. "See you in Aspen." The St. Regis Aspen Resort was a fortress of frosted glass, roaring fireplaces, and old money. For the Sterling Real Estate Holdings annual retreat, Dominic had rented out the entire West Wing. The air was thin, the champagne was Dom Perignon, and the egos were suffocating. Victoria arrived on a Tuesday, 48 hours before the grand presentation. She had travelled separately from Dominic, ostensibly because she needed extra time to pack, but in reality, she was coordinating the final, lethal details with Jonathan Hayes. When she walked into the resort's sprawling lobby, Dominic was already holding court by the central hearth. He wore a fitted cashmere turtleneck and a Rolex Daytona that Victoria's trust had paid for. Serena Croft stood beside him, draped in a white fur coat that made her look like a snow leopard, sleek, predatory, and entirely out of place in a business setting. "Victoria, you made it," Dominic called out. His voice carried across the lobby, drawing the eyes of the junior partners and the major investors, Harrison, Cole, and Richard Miller. Dominic's smile was a weapon of mass condescension. "I was worried the altitude might be too much for your constitution." A few polite, muffled snickers echoed from the group. Victoria didn't blush. She didn't look at the floor. She handed her luggage ticket to the concierge, turned to her husband, and offered a serene, chillingly calm smile. "The altitude is perfectly fine, Dominic. The air is remarkably clear up here. You can see absolutely everything." Serena rolled her eyes, whispering something to Chloe Miller, who covered her mouth to hide a laugh. Victoria ignored them, walking past the group with her head held high. She retreated to the master suite, which Dominic had graciously allowed her to have, claiming he needed a smaller room to focus on the IPO presentation. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological tension. Victoria attended the obligatory luncheons and cocktail hours. She watched as Dominic pitched his grand vision for the future, dropping hints about a massive corporate restructuring that would trim the fat from Sterling Holdings. He was a spectacular showman, painting a picture of a newly agile company, free from legacy burdens. Every time he used the phrase legacy burdens, his eyes flicked momentarily to Victoria. Finally, Friday evening arrived. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis had been transformed into a corporate amphitheatre. A massive digital screen dominated the front of the room. The room was packed with 50 of the wealthiest, most ruthless figures in commercial real estate. Victoria did not wear a forgiving, frumpy sweater. She did not wear an oversized tent. She wore a custom-tailored, floor-length crimson gown that draped beautifully over her curves. She wore her grandmother's vintage diamond collar. She looked regal, immovable, and undeniably present. When she entered the ballroom, the low hum of chatter momentarily faltered. She wasn't hiding anymore. She took her seat at the front table, directly next to the podium. At exactly 8 p.m., Dominic took the stage to thunderous applause. Serena stood in the wings, clutching a tablet, practically vibrating with excitement. This was the moment. The IPO announcement. The transfer of the primary assets to Apex Ventures. The end of Victoria. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dominic began, his voice booming through the sound system. "Tonight is not just about looking back at what Sterling Holdings has accomplished. It is about evolving. In today's market, you cannot be weighed down by outdated models, slow-moving capital, or heavy, inefficient structures." He paused, letting the words hang. Serena smirked from the sidelines. "Which is why," Dominic continued, clicking a button on his remote. The screen behind him lit up with the logo of Apex Ventures. I am thrilled to announce the internal acquisition of our 3 most profitable commercial sectors by our new, agile subsidiary, Apex Ventures. This restructuring will finalize tomorrow morning, paving the way for our initial public offering next quarter. The room erupted into applause. Harrison, Cole, and Richard Miller stood up, raising their glasses. Dominic looked down at Victoria, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. He leaned into the microphone. This transition allows us to leave behind the things and the people that no longer serve the future of this enterprise. Change is difficult, but necessary. He had done it. He had essentially announced her firing and their divorce in front of the entire industry. Victoria waited for the applause to die down. She waited until the silence in the room was absolute. Then she picked up her crystal water goblet, tapped it sharply with her heavy silver spoon, and stood up. "A beautiful speech, Dominic," Victoria said. She didn't use a microphone, but her voice was clear, resonant, and entirely stripped of the meekness they had all come to expect. However, there is a slight inaccuracy in your financial projections. Dominic's smile froze. He gripped the edges of the podium. "Victoria, darling, this isn't the time for your questions. We'll discuss this back in Boston." "Oh, I think Aspen is the perfect place," Victoria replied, stepping away from the table and walking calmly up the short flight of stairs to the stage. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Serena stepped forward from the wings, her face flushed with anger. "Security," Serena hissed into her headset. "Get her off the stage." "Security won't be necessary, Serena," a new, gravelly voice echoed from the back of the ballroom. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. Jonathan Hayes strode into the room, flanked by 2 men in dark suits, carrying thick, steel-reinforced briefcases. Jonathan looked like a silver-haired Grim Reaper descending upon a banquet. Dominic's face drained of color. He recognized Jonathan immediately. "Jonathan, what the hell are you doing here?" "I'm here acting as the primary legal executor of the Sterling Family Trust," Jonathan announced, his voice carrying effortlessly over the stunned crowd. He walked straight up to the stage and handed Victoria a single piece of paper. Victoria turned to her husband. "You see, Dominic, before you can transfer assets to Apex Ventures, you have to actually own them." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Richard Miller lowered his champagne glass, his brow furrowed in sudden anxiety. Dominic let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "I am the CEO, Victoria. I have the signed operating agreements. My lawyers drafted the transfer months ago. You have no idea what you're talking about. Go sit down before you embarrass yourself further. Your lawyers drafted a document based on the sanitized contract you kept in your home safe," Victoria said, stepping up to the microphone. She looked out at the sea of faces, the people who had mocked her weight, her intellect, her very existence. "You forgot about the master filing. Specifically, Clause 47B, the Arthur Sterling Clause." Dominic stepped back, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Jonathan Hayes took the microphone from Victoria. "For those of you unfamiliar with the late Mr. Sterling's foresight," Jonathan stated dryly, Clause 47. B explicitly states that any attempt to transfer more than 10% of corporate assets without the notarized written consent of the primary beneficiary, Mrs. Victoria Gallagher, constitutes corporate fraud. "That's a lie," Serena shrieked from the side of the stage, losing all her cultivated PR polish. "Dom, tell them that's a lie." "It's not a lie," Victoria said smoothly. "And furthermore, the clause states that any such attempt instantly and irrevocably nullifies the offending officer's shares, returning them in full to the trust." The silence in the room was so profound that the crackle of the fireplace sounded like gunshots. Victoria turned to look at Dominic. The arrogant golden boy of Boston real estate was gone. In his place was a pale, sweating, terrified man. You don't own Apex Ventures, Dominic, because Apex Ventures was funded with stolen money. My money. As of 5 p.m. today, Eastern Standard Time, you are no longer the CEO of Sterling Holdings. You own 0 shares. You are, quite literally, trespassing at my corporate retreat. Victoria, wait, Dominic stammered, raising his hands, his voice cracking. Let's talk about this privately. We can negotiate. We're husband and wife. We are plaintiff and defendant, Victoria corrected him, her voice dropping to a glacial chill. The forensic accounting report has already been submitted to the SEC. Given that you wired my capital to offshore Cayman accounts to fund Apex, Jonathan expects the federal indictments for wire fraud to be unsealed by Monday. Serena let out a high-pitched, strangled noise. She lunged forward, grabbing Dominic's arm. Dom, my loan! What about my loan? Victoria shifted her gaze to the mistress. Ah, yes. Serena, you leveraged your Beacon Hill townhouse for a $4 million buy-in to Apex Ventures, a company that is now functionally bankrupt, as its primary assets have been reclaimed by the trust. The bank will be calling in that collateral immediately. I hope you kept the receipt for that white fur coat. You'll need it for the Boston winters when you're renting. Serena stared at Victoria, sheer, unadulterated terror widening her eyes. Her knees buckled, and she slumped against the podium, weeping openly. Suddenly, Harrison, the largest investor in the room, stood up. His face was purple with rage. This is outrageous! We invested in Dominic. We invested in Apex. If you think you can just tank this company out of some petty marital squabble, you overweight, vindictive. Tread very carefully, Arthur, Victoria interrupted, her voice cracking like a whip. She reached into Jonathan's briefcase and pulled out 3 thick manila folders. She dropped them onto the podium with a heavy thud. You think I haven't been paying attention to you? Victoria looked directly at Harrison, then at Cole, and finally at Richard Miller. While you were all laughing at me over crab cakes and champagne, I was doing my homework. She opened the first folder. Arthur Harrison, you're over-leveraged by $60 million on that failed commercial tech park in Austin. The bank was going to call in the loan last week. Harrison's face went from purple to a sickly, chalky white. She opened the second folder. Richard Miller, your commercial mortgage-backed securities have tanked. You've been quietly trying to secure emergency bridge loans for 3 months. Richard sank back into his chair, Chloe clutching his arm in silent panic. I bought all of it, Victoria announced, slamming the folders shut. Jonathan utilized blind trusts to purchase your debt from your respective financial institutions. I don't just own Sterling Holdings. I am now the primary lien holder on every single one of your individual empires. The ballroom was entirely paralyzed. The men who had ruled the city, who had treated her like an invisible, pathetic joke, were now staring at her as if she were a god who had just descended from the sky to cast them into hell. If any of you, Victoria continued, her voice low and absolute, attempt to pull your capital from Sterling Holdings, if any of you speak to the press, or if any of you ever disrespect me again, I will call in your debts so fast it will make your heads spin. I will liquidate your assets, foreclose on your homes, and leave you with nothing but the clothes on your backs. She paused, letting the sheer weight of her power press down on them. You thought I was weak because I took up space, Victoria said, looking around the room. You thought my size was a reflection of my intelligence. You were wrong. My size was just a reflection of how much of your bullshit I was forced to swallow. She turned back to Dominic, who was now weeping silently, his face buried in his hands. "Pack your bags, Dominic," Victoria said, her voice entirely devoid of pity. "You have 1 hour to vacate my resort." Victoria stepped down from the stage. The crowd parted for her instantly, stumbling backward to get out of her way. No one whispered. No one laughed. As she walked down the center aisle in her stunning crimson gown, her head held high, Victoria Gallagher finally felt light. She didn't need to shrink herself to fit into their world anymore. She owned the world. The whispers in Boston's high society changed overnight. Victoria Gallagher didn't just survive the avalanche, she orchestrated it. Today, she sits as the undisputed CEO of Sterling Holdings, a formidable titan whose physical presence is as commanding as her intellect. Dominic and Serena faded into bankrupt obscurity. Victoria proved that true power isn't measured by the space you take up, but by the ground you own.